Hello, and welcome to WordPress Accessibility Day. My name is Amber Hinds, and I am one of the lead organizers of WordPress Accessibility Day, and I'm the CEO of a company called Equalized Digital. I'm here to welcome you today to a session that is a panel discussion called Selling Accessibility to Skeptical Clients. On this panel discussion, we have Colleen Gratzer, who is an accessibility educator, specialist, and designer with Creative Boost and Gratzer Graphics, LLC. Chris Hinds, who is also one of our organizers, and he is the COO of Equalized Digital. And Rob Howard will be leading the panel. He is the CEO of HDC. Please feel free to add any questions in the Q&A tab in Slido, which is the chat that you see to the right of the video on our website. If you want to discuss with other attendees, you can also use the ideas section in Slido. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. As Amber mentioned, I'm Rob Howard. I'm here with Chris Hinds and Colleen Gratzer. We all run various types of digital agencies where we sell accessibility as well as design and development services. So one of the challenges that we often face as business owners who are selling web services is that while we and probably most of the attendees here at WP Accessibility Day kind of already get it and understand the reasoning behind why your website needs to go the extra mile to be accessible to everyone, a lot of clients don't understand that. And they often come back with some range of objections or feedback along the lines of, I don't really understand why we should do this or why we should spend money on this or why I need to do this now versus later. So Chris and Colleen and I are going to chat for the next hour or so about different strategies for what I would call selling accessibility to skeptical clients. And we're going to unpack a lot of different approaches and sales tactics, but also talk about why clients are skeptical and also dig into why you might actually need to do a sales pitch to help your client understand that they should comply with the law, for example, or have a product or a service that's open to everybody. And one of the things I'm most excited to talk about is this idea of, well, I don't want to have to sell it. It's a little bit sleazy or sketchy to have to go sell, inclusion to other people. But here we are, and there are clients who say stuff like, for example, I had an experience with a designer who literally said the words, "I'm not colorblind, so I like this, color scheme." And I was like, okay, well, after everybody's, kind of picked their jaw up off the floor, we were like, well, we need to actually, figure out how to either persuade this person or take over control of the decision making, because this can't go forward in this way, right? So let's dive in a little bit. I mentioned kind of an extreme and offensive objection, right? But usually the objections are really not quite that overt. It's more like, I don't have the budget for it right now, stuff like that. So, Colleen, if you have any, I'd love to hear some objections you've heard from clients where it's like, hey, I'm not necessarily saying out loud that I'm never going to do this, but also I'm not going to fork over the money for it right now. So, for the clients who come to you for design, development, or other services who are not already on board with building an accessibility-friendly site, what kind of responses or language are you hearing from them in their objections?
Well, one thing is definitely cost. So they might say it's too expensive. And so one thing that I will bring up is that, okay, our process includes building an accessible site. And if they're not willing to pay for it, we're not going to change our process to do a non-accessible site, an inaccessible site, right? So what I will tell them is that we'll do our usual process, which is going to increase the accessibility of your site. But unless you pay for it, we're not going to go in and write alt text and add alt text to images. We're not going to go remediate page content, because that can take weeks at a time, and also requires some of their feedback sometimes with the alt text. But I use that too as a selling point, because then they know that at least they're going to get some accessibility, because it's just something we already do. So definitely I hear that about cost. Another big one I hear is, oh, we don't serve anyone with a disability. And so then I educate them about, about that, and about the percentages of people with certain types of disabilities. I mention a few disabilities, and sometimes they're usually like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Another one that I've heard, and I have a lot of designers who are clients too, so I do hear this quite a bit, is accessibility is ugly, or I'm going to have to use dark colors. And I actually had a client who's not a designer. We were designing something for them for an email, and they sent us their brand color palette and decided to not send us their lighter colors because they didn't think we'd be able to use them. So then they wondered, why is the design so dark? Like, well, I didn't realize you didn't send me all the colors. And so those are usually the big things that I hear about. And I haven't heard this myself, but I have heard this from other web designers, is that their clients sometimes go with an overlay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which
and,
is awful.
And I'm sure we're not the only ones who will talk about the sort of superficial JavaScript buttons that, theoretically help, but don't always actually help. Before I kick it over to Chris, I'll add that we actually had a really big client who is like a well-known national brand that everybody will know. And they have like a color scheme that mixes light blue and dark blue. And some of those light blues were intended to have white button text over them, and they just never were going to get anywhere close to hitting that contrast goal. We see this with orange a lot too. It's very difficult to hit the right contrast. Designers will often come in with the opposite idea, like, oh, I should have a white text and an orange button, but really it needs to be black. And but anyway, there were some like national brands that just they've had this color scheme for decades, and it's just not gonna fit our current standards. In that conversation, I actually, there was really no feasible way that we could go back to the like national, multi-billion-dollar brand and be like, change your blue for the website. So we did use an overlay, but it was very much like a last resort. So Chris, I'm curious if you could speak to that same question. What kind of objections or kind of ways to wiggle out of it do you hear from potential clients?
Yeah, Colleen, you covered some of the major ones as you were talking. I was like checking things that I was going to mention off of my list, right? And some of the softer ones though that we hear at times, they're not as overt of an objection. One of them is, I get that accessibility is important. I personally sympathize with that, but can we just do it later? Like that's one that we hear pretty often. Can we just do it as an add-on? And the answer that we generally provide on that one is that you could do it later. It will be more expensive to do later versus considering it at every phase of the project and shifting left with accessibility. Beyond that, one other one I've heard a few times as well, I don't understand why I need to do this because I'm not in government. Right? I'm not in the government sector or the higher ed sector. I'm not in elementary school, right? Why do I have to care about this, right? And I think that there it's just a little bit of education. Let's depending on where you are, where your nexus is as a company, there are laws that may actually apply to you. And a couple other ones. One that we hear a lot of is it seems like accessibility just adds cost for no benefit. Which is kind of dovetails with the whole it's too expensive mindset. And I think that just comes down to, which I'll touch on more later if I get the opportunity, like helping them see what those benefits are. And Rob, I think you have some questions geared towards that. And then finally, and I don't remember if this was one that Colleen mentioned already or not, but one that I've heard before is, well, the people who rely on this assistive technology, they aren't our customers. They don't use our service. They don't use our product. They don't use our website. And I think that in that instance, it's just a lack of imagination or a lack of understanding that we are all aging into needing this technology. Even if we're typically able now, that may not be the case in the future. And so I think in that case, it's just helping them visualize, a different future for themselves and their customers where that may be necessary. But those were the major ones that I didn't think quite got touched on that were front of mind for me.
So you brought up a couple that I think kind of dive into what I think is really one of the most salient parts of this conversation, and really the biggest challenge for business owners is, there's this idea of, well, it's going to cost more later. There's this idea of, well, I'm not in government, right? And I think what those both play into is that now that the government has in the United States explicitly said they're going to enforce the Americans with Disabilities Act on websites, that introduces a whole new layer of potential costs, and it introduces a whole new group of companies that are subject to that law, right? So when I think about it, I think about in a physical space, having a wheelchair ramp in a building or an elevator that is wheelchair accessible is a significant upfront expense for any builder, for any, store owner, business owner, et cetera. Like, someone has to create that object, install it, think about where it's going to fit into the architecture and all that. But I think we culturally accept that it is a requirement and a necessity. And I don't think that there's people out there who are like, oh, I'm building this school and I have to put an elevator in, or I'm building this,
Right.
right? Like, oh, this elevator has to be wide enough for certain purposes. There are some older historic buildings that still have significant issues with that. And certainly there is a margin and edge cases around that. But I think, we can pretty much say that it's universally understood that you should have wheelchair ramps or other wheelchair accessibility in your physical buildings. I think there is an eventual future where we will just make that same we'll all have that same basic, like, upfront understanding for websites, but we're not there yet, right? We're at a place where, like, imagine they just passed the wheelchair ramp law and all the business owners are like, oh my gosh, I have to update my whole store and all this other stuff, right? So, I'm curious, Colleen, I'll go to you first. Like, to what degree do you bring in the legal aspect of this? Because, I have clients who have come to me after getting threatening letters or paying settlements.
Mhm.
Obviously, that is a very negative experience for them, but we want to kind of parlay that into a positive outcome. But that's a very delicate balance. So how do you approach clients who maybe skeptical or on the fence? Do you talk about the threat of a lawsuit? Do you talk about other clients who have gotten sued? Like, how do you approach that in a way that is constructive without being, sort of overly aggressive and kind of like, without making it seem like it's, the quote unquote frivolous lawsuit type of thing?
Right. Well, I do bring up examples and I do talk about the legal aspect because I feel like because I know about it, I'm not doing them any favors by not bringing it up. It really needs to come out. There's no tiptoeing around it. But at the same time, I don't want to bring it up in a way that is going to make them feel like forced into it. And then that, like, I don't want to feel like a sleazy salesperson, right? So I don't approach it that way. I just bring it up kind of nested in with the other benefits of it, and then I will also talk about the legal aspect as just one of those things, but the other ones are more positive benefits. So I bring it in a more positive light. So I bring all of that up and we'll talk about it. But like what you were saying about like wheelchairs, it's like a lot of people think about accessibility as wheelchairs and blind people. And you can see if somebody's in a wheelchair, right? We can see if somebody is walking with a seeing eye dog, but we don't see the people that are coming to the websites. And so I think a lot of that is educating the client so that they understand that, and then they make better decisions. But yes, I definitely will bring up the legal aspect. I don't go crazy with it, but I will talk about that. But I do bring it up with a lot of other reasons.
Imagine an architect and a developer comes to the architect and says, I really want to build this building, but I'd rather it not have a wheelchair ramp, right? The architect would just say, no, like, what's wrong with you, right? But when you say that to a web developer, web designer, now we have to like go into like a debate, right? So,
Right.
when I think about it, like, my vision for the future is like, I want to be the architect who's like, just no, right? And I'll talk a little bit later about how sort of we are starting to work that stuff into our contract and give us more control over stuff like that. But for me, I'm like, you couldn't do all these other things and just exclude the Americans with Disabilities Act from your consideration. But it seems like a lot of clients still feel like it's optional. Chris, what about you? How do you kind of bring the recent sort of legal changes or legal clarifications into your sales pitches to clients?
To echo what you all have said, I do my best to put a positive spin on it, because we do get people that come to us that have gotten a letter, or they're all business owners know one another, within their circles, right? And so if they didn't get a letter, someone in their circle did. And we do hear like some moaning and groaning about it. And I think the most powerful thing to say in those situations is like, do I agree with you that it is unfortunate, and this is my own personal opinion, right? That a small number of opportunistic law firms nationwide are using like predatory tactics to target businesses, when maybe there, in certain situations, there is not actual harm to an individual person taking place, right? And they're looking to make a quick buck or a quick settlement. And what I always say is, I think that's unfortunate. I think it gives accessibility a bad name, because there are so many benefits both to your customers and to you, the business owner, with accessibility, that just kind of get washed over or get covered up because of this negative press and these negative things that are occurring.
Yeah.
And so I try to shift it positively. And I also try to, as quickly as I can, we do touch on legality early in the sales process. We talk about business nexus, where they're located, what sort of laws might apply to them, and even extending beyond accessibility, right? We talk about GDPR and some other things as well. And that's just part of like our normal sales discovery process, to try to set the precedent early on. It's like, okay, like legal risk mitigation is part of our process. But then we very quickly try to pivot that into or away from sort of the negatives of accessibility. And what I do is I just start, like any good salesperson does, we ask about their goals. Like, what are your objectives? What do you want to do? What outcomes is this new website creating for you? And it is very simple, typically, to find some way to tie accessibility into what their actual stated goals are in their own words, right? So if they have objectives that are around SEO, that are around improving their user experience, increasing conversions, just modernizing their web presence, accessibility can be tied to all of that in some fashion. And getting them to kind of like align with you versus it doing this thing, right? And getting them to understand, oh, accessibility completely aligns with my goals, I need to do this, right? That is, to me, sort of the golden goose egg that I'm after, right? And sometimes it's achievable, sometimes it isn't. It depends on the person's mindset. The other thing I'll say is, I think a lot of this will be unique to your company, right? Depending on what company you're selling websites for, if it's your own small agency, or if you're selling for a larger agency and you're attending this talk today, it's going to be down to the audience that you're attracting, right? So I am in the unique and fortunate position that a lot of the people that come to us, because Equalized Digital specializes in WordPress accessibility, because we have Accessibility Checker, our scanning tool that's out there, like a lot of people that come to us, they know about us because of accessibility. They already have the right mindset and the right reasons for wanting their website to be accessible. And so I find that as time goes on, I'm having to have this conversation less and less, but I think that some of that is more down to the kind of people that we're attracting versus another business might attract.
100%.
Yeah. And so, if you're working with primarily SMBs, it's probably more of an uphill battle for you than it is for me, But I would just go back to just try to tie it to their goals in whatever way you can.
Colleen, I know we talked a bit about SEO too. Could you expand upon that idea and how some of these more well-established goals, right, kind of parallel with accessibility? And I think really what it comes down to is, like, when people think SEO, they see themselves making more money, right? Whereas when people think accessibility, they see themselves spending money. In other words, it's an expense versus an income or an investment. So are there other areas, or do you have do you want to go deeper into that idea about how sort of those things, the well-known money makers often parallel with accessibility, and we can tie those things together?
Yeah, I mean, if the content on the site is formatted accessibly, then it's going to work better for SEO. And not just that, but like think of it as, not just somebody finding the website, but finding more relevant content and then staying on that site longer and not just bouncing off because it was formatted properly and somebody was able to find what they were actually looking for. But the other thing too is that, Google could give the site a boost with search engine rank because it is faster than another site. So it kind of gives a leg up there too.
And the other thing that I have noticed recently as something that is kind of just a good user experience, but also is clearly an accessibility boost, is captions and transcripts, right, on podcasts, videos. So there are a lot of times when I'm idly scrolling through my phone, but I don't want to like listen to a speech or whatever I'm looking at on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. But if it has captions, I can keep my volume down and still get it, right? Obviously, those captions double as an accessibility feature, but in that case, it's also just a convenience or positive user experience feature, even for somebody who is able to hear but just doesn't want to turn that volume up at that moment. And I think, for our Press the Issue podcast, we have been putting the full transcript on the page of the podcast episode. So that doubles as an SEO thing, that's an accessibility thing. But also, like, sometimes I just want to go back and find something that I said, 3 months ago in a podcast, and I can just kind of Control F on that page and find it. So having a transcript is, useful in dozens of ways that may or may not be directly related to an accommodation for a disability. But there are many ways that is a valuable thing to do. And even though it costs, they're not that expensive, but it costs, like $50 or something to go get that, podcast transcribed. We then have that content or that searchability forever. So I found that that's been a really useful kind of offshoot.
Yeah, for sure. Me too. Yeah. And I've also had people tell me, people that don't have any kind of a particular disability with hearing or vision, that they've actually said to me about my own podcast that they appreciate having that I put the transcript there because it helps them find stuff like you said. But they also like when I do the transcript, it reads more like an article, like a blog post, because all the ums and things are taken out. So it's more reader friendly for somebody who is just reading it and not just listening to it. So it does help. And people have told me they appreciate that. But yeah, it does totally help with search engine optimization for sure.
Yeah, it's just more good content too, right? So like sometimes, I'll get linked to, let's say like a New York Times podcast that I don't listen to regularly, but somebody says, oh, this was a great one, you should check it out. And it's like, you know what? I may just read 7 paragraphs of that transcript and not spend the hour like finding that thing and listening to it and downloading and everything. So, there's so many ways that kind of creates a positive outcome that is adjacent to accessibility and the ADA, but you're not necessarily making that decision solely for that reason. One thing I would add about the lawsuit angle is that I think we've really been done a disservice by what's called patent trolling. I don't know if you've ever seen these letters, but I had a client years ago who got a letter that said, the person who sent them the letter basically claimed that they owned the patent to the concept of a drop down menu. And they had this like really elaborate patent from the 90s that somebody bought and sold, 20 times. And now they were claiming, and this was like a nationally known hotel chain. And they were basically saying like, pay us a, settlement because your website uses drop down menus. And like, This is the kind of thing that like most people would look at that and roll their eyes. Right. However, now that we actually have a legal framework around the Americans with Disabilities Act applying to websites, I think that context where like, oh, I remember 5 years ago, I got this kind of BS letter from somebody, like that actually really hurts the ability for us to push people on accessibility in the future, because they, I think, conflate the obviously frivolous patent lawsuit with the not obviously frivolous accessibility lawsuit. And Chris, you mentioned, like finding somebody who has been harmed, right? So the legal standard is like, you actually have to have a plaintiff who has standing and has been unable to do something on your website in order to file a lawsuit, I would actually argue that that's pretty easy to find for 95% of these situations, right? Like, obviously, like the famous case is somebody who tried to order a pizza from the Domino's website who was unable to do that. I've talked to clients who were like, well, only one person has ever complained about this, and I'm like, well, guess how many plaintiffs you need for a lawsuit? You need one, right? Like, this doesn't have to be like a
you just
massive
need one person with the
problem, right?
motivation and the
Exactly.
resources
Yeah.
and the backing to
Yep.
go after you.
And they may not even be seeking a huge amount of money. They may just be seeking a remediation to the problem, right? I think that taking the legal route kind of gets an unnecessarily bad rap in our heads. I certainly know a lot of people who will just anecdotally be like, "Oh, it's just a bunch of lawyers getting paid and blah blah blah." But like, we live in a place in time and in the world where like you are required to follow the law, and the law is built to help people, right? Ideally. So, you can argue on the margins like, well, this law shouldn't exist, or this law should be slightly different, or it's not being interpreted correctly. But like, I don't think this is one of those situations. Like, I think it's clear that like you should have a wheelchair ramp and your website should be able to be used by the maximum number of people, right?
Yeah. It's like, would you, the question that I can always go back to is asking the business owner, it seems like an absurd question, but it usually elicits the right responses. Would you put a doorknob on the front door of your business?
Yeah.
Right. That enough said. No one's going to say no to that. So why are you going to, make it hard for someone to get in the front door of your business from your website, where arguably, the digital storefront is the more important storefront for most businesses these days? It's baffling to me when someone pushes back, after that question. At that point, maybe someone burned them at one point. I'm not sure. Or there's some other underlying objection there that I don't want to touch. Like, Rob, you mentioned, just outright offensive beliefs, right? But yeah, the doorknob question usually gets them.
That's a good analogy. Nice. I like that. I'll have to use that.
That leads into another kind of question about just kind of like framing and phrasing things for people and helping people who are doing design or doing marketing understand like what are our limitations and why do they exist, or what might we have to like rethink. So one of the things that we see a lot is we see designers who want to have the most modern, edgy, cool, cutting edge website imaginable, and they often will create stuff in Figma or whatever other design and prototyping tools they're using that either are just unquestionably impossible to do accessibly, or are going to be way more expensive to do with accessibility in mind. So how do you talk to a designer or a client who's like, I love this idea, like look at how this thing scrolls up and down and you've got this thing floating over here, right? And it's like, okay, like slow down, like this may look cool, but we also need to think about everybody who might be using this. So Colleen, do you ever have that experience where you have to sort of like burst someone's bubble on a really fancy design?
Yeah, I have had that happen, but because I've been in the design industry for 25 years, I don't feel like it's like me against them. I don't feel like they think that, because I always approach it with, look, I want to keep your design intact as much as possible, but at the same time, here's why this is going to be a problem. And so if I have to, I mean, I could even do a demonstration, if it's something I can do a demonstration for, and like maybe show them something with Funkify or No Coffee, one of those visual disability simulators, just to kind of help them understand. But I also tell them like, look, it's not just about accessibility, it's about a good user experience. And we don't want to make people think, because if you have to make people think and they have to know, like you need to have like a guide to use your website, that's a design fail. So I think the fact that I have the design background helps, but I also approach it with like, this is why, very objectively. It's not like my opinion. It's like, this is why this is a problem too.
Mm-hmm. Has anyone ever asked or demanded, for lack of a better word, to do something against your advice? And if so, how you handled that?
Yes. I forget what it was. It was a long time ago, and luckily it's only been like once or twice. I will tell them that, like, if you're going to go against my advice, you're going to have to sign something. I'm putting it in writing, and you're going to have to sign something, because I'm not going to be responsible for this, because I want them to take it seriously and understand, look, I'm not going to put myself at some kind of legal risk because you're not listening, you know? So yeah, I will absolutely do that.
I think that's also
just sign the paper. Generally gets them to do an about face.
Yeah.
We do the same thing.
Yeah. Usually
I have had people sign it though and be like, you know, like, so, and that actually brings up another question, and these two things are going to kind of weave together. I kind of had them in my head as two different topics, but let's weave them together. So, you know, I want to talk about like this question of like, you know, I think the typical web design and development contract is already going to include some, you know, warranty and liability statements, right? And basically, you know, like, since the beginning of time, when I was building websites, I had a, you know, boilerplate contract, and it said something like, there's no warranty for any, you know, specific use. Like, basically, like, you can't sue me for not being happy with this website after you accept the results, right? So, and we have people sign what is essentially like an approval agreement, like, you did what we said we were going to do, and the project is done, right? So they're definitely, you know, there's definitely already, I think, some framework for the web designer or developer not getting like sued directly for a site that's not accessible. Ultimately, that is going to be on the owner of the business who is presenting that website to the world.
But it has happened.
Yeah, and
it has happened that a developer's been sued.
Yeah, tell me about that story in more detail, Colleen, if you know.
I think it was the Wet Willie's bar chain or something. I think it was them. I think that the plaintiff brought a claim against them and the web developer, and maybe even the host.
Mm-hmm.
You
just
know,
like putting more defendants on the list, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember that much about it, but I read about it a long time ago. But yeah.
And I'd be curious like what the outcome of that would be. Like, I think a good lawyer could probably get that defendant, like, especially the host. Like, the host is clearly not responsible for something that you put on the internet.
But then there's the cost to defend yourself. So
exactly.
You know.
Yeah. And it's not the kind of thing where you would get legal fees reimbursed. Like, it's like you gotta like show up and defend yourself, right? So obviously you can't ever totally prevent that, but I think having clear language in your contract is becoming more and more important. I'm sure you guys could both talk a bit about kind of where you are with your like contracts and language around that. And I also think, you know, one of the things that we're working on at HDC is actually putting language in the contract that shifts the power in that decision, right? So you talked about like, okay, a client really wants to do this thing. They're going to have to sign an against my advice document of some kind, right? One of the things that we're experimenting with is actually having the contract say, if you, the client, present to us a request or a design that we believe would violate the Americans with Disabilities Act, we are just going to change it, whether you like it or not. You know, and obviously, like, there's some gray area in there, but that's something that we're experimenting with, and that's, I think, where like the architect sort of you know, analogy comes in. Like, obviously, you would expect an architect to refuse to design something that doesn't even come close to being up to code. So we want to get to a place where, as developers and designers, like, we're essentially going to refuse to build something that's not up to code in the sense of the ADA.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, I'm curious how you phrase things from a contract standpoint to protect yourself, but also to sort of set the right expectations up front with clients.
I mean, I think from a liability perspective, there are a couple of things that we do. One is just working with your attorney, right? Having an attorney write an actual contract for you, making sure that they have a solid indemnification clause in your contract for after delivery, basically meaning, you know, you can't be pulled into lawsuits for X, Y, and Z reasons. And one of them for us is client content or client use of the deliverables, right? Those are two things in our indemnification clause, because we want to make sure, hey, if you go in and you change a bunch of stuff on your website, and because, right, once you hand I'm rambling a little, but once you hand a website off to a client, all bets are off, unless they're on a maintenance plan and you're handling all the changes. So you have to make sure that you're protected if you don't force your clients into a maintenance plan where your team and the people you trust retain complete control of the website, right? But even beyond that, the other thing in our guarantee is we only will guarantee the accessibility of things that we have a direct hand in creating. So whether that's the theme or aspects of a design or custom blocks in Gutenberg or content that's been manually inserted into a page, right? But anything that's imported, anything that's either legacy code or third-party code where there's a known issue with it, like all of those things are excluded from our accessibility guarantee because we can't control those things, right? So only guarantee what you can control and make sure that you have an out if you're handing websites off and not maintaining them yourself. Those would be my two big pieces of advice.
We also have something in our contract that limits our damages to the amount paid and stuff like that. So like you're not getting into a position where you could, be sued for more than the value of the project or anything like that. And obviously even that would be a very extreme situation. Colleen, what about you? How do you phrase this in legal terms for clients?
Yeah, so I do similar to what Chris does, but what you were saying about guaranteeing accessibility. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't guarantee accessibility if the client is, they're updating the site or they have somebody else that is, doing the technical updates or anything like that. I also tell them though about their documents, because a lot of times documents can get overlooked. And so, they need to have those made accessible as well. So I do bring that up. And I actually limit my liability to 50% of the project fee, because they're responsible for approving certain things. I mean, obviously they're hiring me for certain expertise, but they are also required to like review certain things and take ownership of that. So I limit it to half of the project fee. And so very similar to what Chris said.
And I think one thing I hear from both of you is like, this is really a group effort, and thus it's simultaneously very difficult and in some ways risky to everyone involved, right? So,
right,
in the sense that like you could deliver something that is fantastic and effectively perfect, and in the moment the person who's writing the blog posts over at the client company gets their hands on it, all of a sudden, where are the alt tags? All of a sudden, the headings are out of order, and you start to go down this rabbit hole of inaccessibility. And I think, without talking too much about the page builder problem, I also think that giving your client the ability to do everything but the kitchen sink on those pages essentially guarantees that somebody's going to break something and it's not going to be accessible 3 months or 6 months from now in the way that it was when you handed it over. So there's this, a website is always going to be a collaboration, right? Between independent contractors, employees, business owners, designers, developers, writers, interns, etc. Right? And ultimately, the buck stops with the person who owns the business to train everyone to understand and care about this. But also, like, it's a lot of work, right? Like, it's work that they may not have been expecting. It's stuff you have to learn, right? And I think there definitely could be a preconception of like, oh, well, the internet's just easy and basic. I'm basically just like typing stuff in and I don't have to think about it, right? But obviously that's changing as the internet is getting sort of more advanced. We have more regulation via the ADA now and stuff like that. So in the same vein as the privacy laws, right? The application of the ADA law to websites requires everyone to learn more. And I think that can be sometimes a frustrating experience for people because, having more requirements and being required to do more and know more inherently increases costs to some degree, right? One question that I saw in the comments is, what about the idea that if a client has major accessibility problems on their site, that to some degree it'll impact their reputation, right? Do you ever talk with Colleen? Do you ever talk with clients about that, and how do you kind of frame that?
Yes, I preach this to clients. I preach it to designers that I train in accessibility. Yeah, definitely with reputation, because it's not just when you think about branding is reputation. So it's not just visual branding, it's also like their messaging, and also like, is accessibility, is inclusiveness important to this business? And 71% of people with a disability that go to a website that is not accessible will leave that website. And I think that was the click away pound study or something. And so what happens is, like, there we have Google reviews, we have Yelp, we have all kinds of review sites, Facebook pages where you can leave reviews. I mean, people talk usually when they don't like something. And so definitely that's going to affect a brand's reputation in a positive or a negative manner, if their site is accessible or not. So, and that's going to then affect the bottom line.
And just to piggyback on that, few things are sadder than a brand that makes all of these espousments about diversity, equity, inclusion, and having strong mission statements around diversity, but then you go to their website and it's a dumpster fire in terms of accessibility, right?
Right.
And that's something that you can point out, and you have to have good rapport with the customer in order to be able to point that out in a sales conversation. Otherwise they may just get offended and shut you down. But if you've had a few conversations with them being like, look, you're not living up to your own stated goals, or another favorite of mine is just looking at their competitors, right? So if there are a couple of competitors that you can track down to your customer or your potential customer that are already accessible or are doing good things in terms of accessibility, and turning around and saying, hey, so-and-so is already doing this.
I'll just tell them. I just rip the Band-Aid off and I'll just tell them.
Yeah.
I love the idea.
I don't have to have any conversations beforehand with them.
I love the idea of a wealthy business owner getting offended when being called out for not achieving or even attempting to achieve their own DEI goals, like that. Like that person taking offense to that is the most hilarious upside down scenario I could possibly imagine. But we do know that happens all the time. Chris, I'm curious what you think about, there is a potential bill going through Congress called the Websites and Software Applications Accessibility Act. Have you dug into that at all? And if so, can you tell us about it and kind of how you think that's going to shape the future of this conversation?
I actually have not dug into that bill. I'm a little embarrassed to say.
Neither have I, and that's why I posed the question to you. So there we go. Okay, welcome back to that question.
But do you have any high-level impressions? Is it one of those where they're trying to limit business liability in terms of accessibility, or is it the opposite?
I'm going to Google it while we answer the next question, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about that.
Okay, sounds good.
The next one is about, and these are coming from the chat. How often do you get to train clients after you've given the keys to their new accessible website? So I think, this is kind of like a parallel to the, like, is this person just going to take this website and mess it up and it's going to be a dumpster fire in 6 months, right? So Colleen, how do you handle, like, for example, content training? Because obviously there's, you have quite a bit of control. You have quite a bit of, ability to mess things up, for lack of a better way of putting it. So how do you handle training the client and making sure that training is actually sustained and useful and applied?
So what I do is I'll create a guide that has to do with how to update their content accessibly. So like images and text, headings, audio and video. I'll give them a guide which has hyperlinks to like various services, like for captioning or transcripts, things like that. I also will do a live video call with them to show them around the site as well. But since a lot of people, like, they get excited about the guide and then they never look at it again. So one thing that we've done very successfully is, and this is also to help them maintain the accessibility without having to think too much about it, is we do a lot of work with advanced custom fields to prevent them from being able to get into certain things and formatting them some way that we don't want them to. And so we'll put little instructions, like notes in the fields, above the fields, so they can see, okay, enter this and only enter this, or upload this kind of file or whatever it is, right? So we'll put in some short instructions where needed, so it's right there in their face and they don't have to go find their guide and then figure out, okay, what am I supposed to do here? And then the guide also will have like screenshots to things as well. So it's kind of like a user manual for their website that also incorporates accessibility practices.
And it feels to me like the more you document it, the more them ignoring it looks bad for them and looks good for you, right? So in that scenario where somebody comes back and is like, what happened here? Why are we getting this letter, 6 months later? It's like, well, do you remember this extensive training that I gave you that you ignored? Well, this is the consequence of that, right? So, I think that while it is always like extra work and extra expense, like being more thorough seems like the way to go with this.
Yeah. And it was actually, at least in part, out of the frustration of handing off websites that we knew were perfectly accessible and watched them get systematically ruined, that we built Accessibility Checker, because we wanted to have something that was directly in the edit screen to give people direct feedback. And that's been an evolving thing because not all customers use it, right? So we're still trying to figure out ways to make that useful and to get more customers to engage with that tool and help keep content accessible as they're entering it. And I think that, that for us, and that I think, through by virtue of Colleen's documentation, like having tooltips and messages directly in the ACF editing areas, like it's those sorts of preventive steps that are going to ultimately get us to a better place, and like actually going out and anticipating, that the customer is going to create problems. I also think that care plans with agencies have a bigger role to play in this than a lot of agency owners might think right now. And I think starting to roll accessibility into your care plans, have a scanning solution that's either native WordPress or external, whatever you like, right? And have a plan in place, at least for accessibility basics. Like you don't necessarily have to have an auditor on staff, but if you have a good scanning solution that's not an overlay that can detect some basic problems and flag those for you and for your customer, I think that is a good thing to add onto your care plans. It'll increase the value. You could probably justify charging more.
And
care
that
plans are
plugin,
always a great source of revenue for everyone too. So if we can combine consistency of revenue with improvements to the site, I think that's always a win-win. We have about 2 minutes left. Colleen, why don't you finish that last thought and then we'll dive into
I was just going to say the Accessibility Checker plugin is great. And I've seen some different ones, and I find that my clients find it much easier to understand than some others.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Agreed. A sales pitch for the Accessibility Checker.
Did not intend that, I promise. I'm sorry.
The law we mentioned was introduced by Senator Tammy Duckworth and one other representative, and basically it would take the court decisions around the ADA and clarify them at the legislative level. So we're not just relying on judges. We're actually saying the ADA does apply to websites. And it sounds like they want to maybe apply some actual standards. Like that's something we didn't talk about, but the question of like, well, is this WCAG 2.1 AA, AAA, single A, 2.2, whatever, right? Like there's a lot of standards and they're similar, but there is some nuanced differences to them. So it sounds like,
knowing the U.S. government, they're not going to rely on an external standard. They're going to create their own that all of us.
And there's Section 508, right? Like there's all these things. So it sounds like they want to legislatively clarify that. And I would say like, I'm operating personally under the assumption that is already how a judge would interpret it, but it certainly does not hurt for the legislature to also, put that in writing. We have a minute left. What is the one thing that you would ask a client to do tomorrow that would take them less than an hour to go in and fix up accessibility on their site? Colleen, do you have an easy fix, or what is the number one easy fix that people don't do?
Oh, so, okay, here's one. I would say go slap an accessibility statement on that site if you don't have it, because that is easy to do, because you can just write something about your commitment to accessibility and talk about what effort you're taking. There's also some accessibility statement generators out there. Nice. And a lot of people will overlook this. Like when I do website audits, I often find that people are trying to make their website accessible, but they're not putting the accessibility statement on there. So it's very important to do that. And according to some lawyers, that can prevent some legal issues. And I kind of look at it as like a beware of dogs sign to a robber. They will see that sign and maybe move on to the next house. They don't want, they don't want to mess with that. So
Chris, what do you think? What's a simple fix that people aren't doing but should be doing?
I don't know if I would be able to tell this to my customers. I think you said reach out to one of your customers, but I would say, if you have customers that are using accessibility overlays, reach out to them and ask them to reconsider that relationship and make a game plan in 2023 to start introducing true accessibility instead of a Band-Aid.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris and Colleen. It's been really fun. We're going to wrap it up and move on to our next session. And it's been really fun chatting with you guys. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rob, Colleen, and Chris, for this fabulous session on selling skeptical clients on accessibility. You can continue the conversation in the chat for about the next 10 minutes, and then we will refresh the chat so it'll be set up for our next conversation. You can also tag us on social media with hashtag WPA11Y Day and hashtag WP 2022. Oh, sorry, WPAD 2022. We also appreciate if you would go to wpaccessibility.day/feedback to provide anonymous feedback for our speakers about their presentation, and you have the option to win a t-shirt while you are there. Stay tuned for our next session, which will be a collection of 3 different lightning talks from Nick McClure, Sandy Feldman, and Helen Sean. And that will be coming up in about 10 minutes right here. While you're waiting, don't forget to visit our sponsors pages to grab virtual swag, enter for a chance to win great prizes. You can also chat with some of our sponsors in their Slack channels on the WordPress Accessibility Day chat. See you soon.